I'm David Allen, and this is the third in a series of videos about the proposals in my new book called The Living Vote. Now, in earlier videos I explained that what the system will achieve, what the proposal will achieve, would be to move power much closer to the people and away from the elites. In the second video I explained that our parliament would be made up of 3/4 party members and 1/4 independence members. In this video I'm going to explain to you how they get there, what the voting system is, and I'll also go through the benefits that this voting system brings, because they're not immediately apparent. And then in future videos I'll take each one of those benefits and explain why that is the case. Okay, firstly, just a little bit of history. Now, I developed this voting system which is called first to past the post. It doesn't sound hugely different, does it? But believe me, it is. F2PTP. And I developed it in 2015. I made all the constituencies bigger because, as I've said before, in order to get greater proportionality, you need more than one Member of Parliament per constituency, in order to retain as far as possible that connection between the constituent and their MP. This is the person you can go and see at any time, you can write to. That role, which is important but limited, as I'll explain, that has to be retained. And the closest you can get to that is by having 2 Members of Parliament per constituency, which effectively means that constituencies had to be twice the size. Now, that's not the system that's in the Living Vote, because it was another 7 years before the final piece of the jigsaw fell into place. And I wrote the book in around about February, March last year, when this happened. And the final piece of the jigsaw was the independence part, the quarter of Parliament that are independents. Because whilst the voting system, F2PTP, is far better than the voting system we have now, it would still have led to coalition government. And I wanted to avoid that because British people don't like coalitions, and for good reason. And I will explain in future videos why PR is such a very bad idea. You may know I live part of the time in Sweden, which has a fully proportional system, and it's a disaster, to be honest. Okay, back to the voting system. So in 2015 I developed the system and I worked through it. I merged all the constituencies in the United Kingdom with a map and a great deal of effort. It took several weeks to do that, because you can't suddenly be left with one constituency on the coast that you merge with another one. And I applied the F2PTP voting system to those newly enlarged constituencies and documented the results. Now, that paper is part of the book in the appendix, so you can see exactly what happened. But what it showed to me was that even when people didn't know that second place would also be elected, the results showed that 1.5 times more people got the MP they voted for. Now, we have larger constituencies. 2 MPs are elected per constituency. That keeps the same number of MPs overall. And the way they're elected is with a simple vote, exactly as you do now. People get their ballot papers, you tick the person that you want to vote for. The votes are all added up. The first place candidate and the second place candidate are elected to Parliament. When they are in Parliament, they no longer have 1 vote each, but they will cast exactly the same number of votes as the votes they received in the election. Okay, let me just explain that a little bit more. Now we have a general election, which is in fact 650 local elections. The winners of those elections are elected to Parliament. The party that has the most seats usually will form the government in one way or another, whether by majority government if it has enough seats, coalition if it doesn't have enough, or what's called supplying confidence if they're perhaps short of just a few votes, which happened with Theresa May's government and the Democratic Party in Ireland. Now, under this system, the first and second place candidates in each constituency, each larger constituency, are elected, but they no longer have this equality of voting in the House of Parliament. That's what happens now. MPs get elected, and when they vote, they have one vote each. What that means is that members of Parliament, like the SNP's Angus MacNeil, who is the Member of Parliament for the Western Isles, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the constituency name, he was elected to Parliament. He gets just over 6,000 votes. That's happened in a few elections. Whereas you have an MP like George Howarth, who's the MP for Knowsley in Liverpool, got 47,000 votes. They both have one vote in Parliament. That means that the votes of the voters of the Western Isles are 8 times more valuable than the votes of the voters in Knowsley. That's crazy. And this discrepancy happens throughout Parliament. That particular example is the largest one. But there are many, with members of Parliament being elected with few votes, a lot of them Scottish and Welsh and Northern Ireland, and other members of Parliament elected with huge numbers of votes. So then to just give them one vote each in Parliament is hugely disproportional. The Living Vote describes a system, first 2 parts of both, that changes this completely. And this is what makes constituency sizes much less significant. So, for example, let's take a constituency I'm familiar with as it happens is, say, Tunbridge and Morning in Kent. Now, let's say, for example, the Conservative Party candidate, who always wins there, as they generally do in the South East, gets 30,000 votes. And let's also say that second place is usually Labour, and they get 15,000 votes. That's not an untypical spread, to be honest. Now, under the F2PTP system, they would both be elected. And when they got into Parliament, when they voted, the Conservative Party candidate would cast 30,000 votes. And the Labour Party candidate would cast 15,000 votes, directly proportional to the support that they received in the election. Now, at the moment, all of that is made a nonsense, because once you've voted, your vote is thrown away. Once the Member of Parliament is elected, your vote's gone. It plays no further part for the next 5 years. But in that example I gave you, where the Conservative Party candidate gets 30,000 votes and the Labour Party candidate gets 15,000, the Conservative Party candidate only needed 15,001 to win. The other 14,999 votes he got, were completely wasted. They were of absolutely no value whatsoever. They might just as well have been thrown on the fire. Utterly pointless. But if one Member of Parliament has much more support, why should that not be reflected in Parliament when they vote? Now, the same thing will apply for the independence ballot paper as well. 2 members of Parliament will be elected as independents for each of the independents constituencies, and the same thing will apply. First and second are elected, and they will cast the number of votes that they received in the election divided by the number of constituencies that they span. To do it with the number of votes they actually got would be hugely disproportionate, because what that means is that they would have half the voting power in Parliament, whereas the intention is that it should be around about a quarter. Okay, so let me go through that again. You go to the ballot box, you have your ballot papers, you choose the candidate that you want. The votes are simply added up. The first place candidate is elected and the second place candidate is elected. When they are in Parliament, they cast the number of votes they received in the election. That means wasted votes disappear completely, they just don't occur. The other interesting facet of this change is that the second place Member of Parliament, for parties in particular, for independents we don't yet know because there's never been an independence election so far, but for parties, the second place candidate is likely to be of the opposite political persuasion to the first place candidate. And whilst I gave an example in Kent of Conservatives winning and Labour coming second, equally in Liverpool that would be the other way round. Labour would come first, Conservatives would be second. But they would only cast the number of votes they received. So what becomes important, and this is very significant for aligning the power exercised in Parliament to the will of the people, what becomes important then is the votes that they received, not the number of seats that they occupy. And that's very significant. Okay, can I just recap that once more? You get the ballot paper, whether postal voting or in a polling booth. You mark the candidate you would like, that you most prefer. And at the end of the election, first and second place candidates are elected and they cast the number of votes in Parliament that they received in the election. The other really interesting point about doing it this way is that parties who at the moment stand no chance whatsoever of winning a seat. You can see that for all elections. History going back over years tells exactly the same story. UKIP in 2015 was a famous example, got 3,800,000 votes in the general election and won one seat. They outpolled, in terms of numbers of votes, the Liberal Party and the SNP together. Yet the Liberal Party got about 8 seats after their collapse and the SNP got 56 or something like that. Quite ridiculous. However, the other thing that's wrong with the power dynamics in Parliament is that none of it made any difference because the Prime Minister has all the power. Doesn't matter how many seats opposition have got, if they don't have the majority or they can't challenge a majority, their power is zero. That changes also significantly with the proposals in the Living Vote. Now, the addition of the independents occurred 7 years after I developed the voting system. What was significant about that is it removed the need for a coalition government because the independents stand alone as 128 independent people and they will make their own minds up. So for a government to get legislation through, they simply have to convince a number of the independents to support them. No longer can they rely on just instructing their members of Parliament to vote the way that the government want them to vote, which is what happens now. I mean, it's a travesty. 90% of the role of a Member of Parliament is as a legislator. They make laws. They're going to make laws, you would expect them to read them first. Well, often they don't. The Brexit withdrawal agreement was a typical example. Not even the Prime Minister read it. So they didn't really know what they were voting for. So they don't actually have to do anything because they turn up, they're told how to vote. Most of them follow that blindly. And they spend a bit of time in their constituencies with the problems of individual people, which is important. I mean, we Brits like that connection. But it's not hugely significant. Their major role is as legislators, and that's the job that they should be doing. The independent members of Parliament, however, will not have any loyalty to a party for their seat. They will have won their seat on their own merit. So the collection of independents and the first two past the post voting system I have called F2PTP-IND for independence. So it's a combination of first two past the post and the independence election. And that addresses most of the problems that we have in Parliament. Now, briefly, let me run through the benefits that the voting system will provide again, and then in later videos I'll go through them in more detail. Firstly, our concept of the red-blue wall or the north-south divide completely disappears. At the moment, most of the south of England is Conservative, most of the north of England is Labour, most of Wales is Labour. Under the living vote system, the first two past the post, there will be both Labour and Conservative politicians, or members of Parliament in fact, in every party seat. Well, 80% of them, not everyone, but 80% of them. Because about 80% go Labour and Conservative in every election. So instead of Kent being full of Conservative members of Parliament, it will have members of Parliament from both the Conservative and Labour Party. Now that has to be a good thing. No longer will you have a red block in the north and a blue block in the south, but they'll all be red, blue, yellow, green, whatever. Second point is that the likelihood of smaller parties getting votes is raised enormously, because if second place is available, that hurdle of having to win disappears. Now you only have to come second. All right, you get less votes in Parliament because you receive less votes in the election, but that's only fair. That's what fairness is, and it is about bringing the exercise of power in Parliament closer to the will of the people, which is what all of this is about. It makes constituency sizes much less significant. Why? Well, it doesn't really matter how big the constituency is. The Member of Parliament votes with the number of votes they got. The other thing that changes quite dramatically with this system is that tactical voting is virtually eliminated. It's quite difficult to know who to vote against when there are two winners. Now think about it. And if your party has a much greater chance of winning a seat, let's say you're a Liberal Democrat or a Green candidate, at the moment you have no chance. So what generally happens, the pattern is that the Green Party and the Liberal Democrat Party have a pact perhaps with Labour so that they don't stand, so the other party has more chance. But if the bar is lowered to second place, then there's much more chance, because the elector will become aware of this as well. The voter will know that second place is also up for grabs, and they are much more likely to vote for the candidate of their real choice as opposed to the one they have to vote for to keep the other lot out, which is what happens at the moment. Now, as I've said, I'll go through in detail these other benefits in later videos, which hopefully will be a bit shorter. But for now, if you think this is something that you could support, please subscribe. Please hit the notifications bell and give me a like. But most of all, understand what the process is fully, and the best way to do that is to buy the book. You can read it in an afternoon. It's not huge, it's as long as it needs to be to detail all of these proposals. So once again, the voting system itself is called first two past the post. Two members of Parliament are elected. When they vote with the number of votes that they received in the election. That system applies to both the party members, which make up 3/4 of Parliament, and the independent members, who make up about 1/4 of Parliament. By those means, your vote lives on throughout the entire Parliament. That's why it's called the living vote. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.